This is a true story that happened to my parents in the 1970s in Surrey in England. They had invited a couple of friends over for a game of cards, but the evening had barely started when there was a power cut. At that time there was an energy crisis due to oil shortages, and power cuts were unfortunately very common. Luckily, the frequency of these events meant that candles were readily to hand, and soon the four were seated around the kitchen table by candlelight exchanging stories, which inevitably became more and more spooky. One of the guests suggested that they use an Ouija board to see if they could contact any spirits. The board was a common game in the 1970s, and was strangely originally marketed to children, and it was seen as a bit of fun and nothing more sinister or dangerous. Unfortunately, they didn't own a board, and so they took down the large circular mirror from the hallway and used lipstick to write the letters of the alphabet on the surface, along with the words yes and no. They then placed an upturned wine glass in the center, and all put their fingers on it. The wine had flowed freely, and no one was really taking the game seriously. One of the men seemed to be trying to force the glass to move just to scare the women, and after a while of no results, they grew tired of the game and returned to chatter. The next morning, the mirror was cleaned and returned to the hallway. A few days passed. One night, my dad was away doing a gig with his band. He worked as a draftsman but enjoyed writing and music in his spare time, so was often away with his band. Another power cut, and so my mum went to bed early, not really tired enough to sleep. Then the story takes a mysterious turn. As she lay there, she could hear a quiet tapping sound, as if someone was scraping their nails down the window pane outside. Then she realized the sound was coming from inside the house, down in the hallway. She lit a candle and walked down the stairs to the hall. There the sound was again. It was as if someone was tapping the mirror. She moved closer. The noise stopped. Had she been mistaken? She waited 20-30 seconds. Again the tapping. She rushed back up to bed and waited for my dad to return. A few weeks later, my mum's friend Grace was visiting. As they were putting their coats on in the hallway, she remarked that the hallway had a very bad energy. It felt cold, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mum laughed and said she had heard this from a few people. She told her about the tapping on the mirror, and that they had used it as a Ouija board. The woman became very serious. She was a spiritualist and believed that using a Ouija board in such a way was very dangerous. It could open a portal for bad spirits, particularly if not used correctly with proper protection of prayer, or if used for fun. Spirits could also attach themselves to people in the group, especially sensitive or creative individuals like my dad. Around this time, my dad's behavior started to change. He used to be full of fun, and the house was always full of music. But after the night with the mirror, he had started to become more and more serious, less tolerant, and stayed away at night more and more. One day we were all in a playground. I was 3 or 4 years old. An elderly man walked past and sat watching us from an opposite bench. My dad whispered to my mum, "That's the demon. He's never going to leave me alone." Over the next few weeks, on entering the house, my mum didn't linger in the hallway. She always had a sense of being watched. One evening she returned home after dark. As she pulled up in the car, she realized that the whole street had no power. She entered the hall by the light of her lighter and hurriedly took off her coat, not wishing to spend any time in the hall. Then she saw it. A dark, shadowy figure in the mirror. Not a reflection. Within the mirror. She rushed upstairs where my dad was already in bed, and they cuddled up together by candlelight. The next day, my mum took down the mirror, wrapped it in an old sheet and put it into the attic space. She phoned her friend Grace, who had warned her about the mirror, and Grace suggested that we go to London to consult a Catholic priest she knew. I have no memory of the visit, but apparently the priest blessed my sister and I, and gave my mum a small gilded Bible and a crucifix. He told her that if she felt a presence in the house again, that she should hold the Bible and recite the Lord's Prayer. Inevitably, a few weeks later, my mum was alone again, and she awoke at around 3 a.m. to hear a shuffling noise from the attic above. She went to switch on the light, but the power was out. Pulling the covers up to her face, she looked around the room. The darkness seemed to be closing in on her, as if it were a thick black blanket. Terrified, she reached for the Bible. As she touched it, a spark-like static momentarily lit the room. She recited the Lord's Prayer several times before eventually getting back to sleep by candlelight. At this time, my dad was also becoming increasingly paranoid about being followed, and after much persuasion, he agreed to go to London to see the same priest. The next day, my mum received a telephone call from the priest. He told her that my dad had a demonic spirit attached to him, and that he had been unable to detach it. He then told her that she should take her children and leave him, for everyone's safety. I still find it incredible that someone from the church would advise that. A few weeks later, we had a knock on the door and the bailiffs were there to repossess the house. My mum called my dad's office and was told that he had left the company several months earlier. He didn't return that night, or ever. In later years, I found out that my mum had hired a private detective to find my dad, and he was found to be living in a caravan with a woman from his band. Both were heavily into drugs, and his life had gone completely off the rails. Years later, I decided to look my dad up on the internet. I found he was working as a deacon in a Baptist church. On the website, there was a section for my story, and I was amazed to read it. He told the whole story of the mirror and the spirit that had attached itself to him. He claimed that he had been saved by becoming a born-again Christian. He described the vicar pulling the demonic spirit from his body and said that he felt the love of God flowing into him. So was the spirit real? Or was it just the product of over-imaginative minds in those dark nights with power cuts? My mum has never been religious, but she still has the Bible gifted to her by the priest beside her bed, within reach. If you could hear her tell the story, you would believe every word. And as for the mirror, well, when the house was repossessed, the mirror went with it. So if you see a gilded circular mirror in a charity shop or listed on eBay, think very carefully before buying it, or you might be receiving an unwanted visitor yourself. This is a story that happened to my friend Sarah in Brighton in the 1990s. For years, she'd had a recurring dream. Every 6 or 7 months, she'd dream she was in a bar, talking to an American man. He said he'd heard she did cleaning work, and asked if she would be interested in a job cleaning his flat. In the dream, when she entered the flat, it was like some horrible nightmare. It was dark, damp, and full of cobwebs. None of the lights worked, and the only light came from the street lamps outside. One of the bedrooms was full of terracotta pots stacked up to the ceiling, and more. A dark figure stood in the corner of the room staring at her, and it spoke. "Help me! Help me!" It repeated. It was terrifying. At that point, she always woke up. She had some mediumship abilities, but had never tried to develop them. She often wondered what this dream meant, but she didn't tell anyone about it. One day she was out with some friends and they introduced her to an American friend of theirs. She suddenly experienced a feeling of déjà vu, and even more so when the man asked if she would clean his flat. Exactly as in the dream. She was apprehensive but too curious to refuse. The flat was only a street behind where she lived. She took her friend Susie with her as moral support, explaining all the details of the dream. They cautiously and nervously entered the flat. It was a beautiful space, sunlight streaming through the windows and well maintained. Nothing at all like the dream. The bedroom had no terracotta pots and no feeling of dread. "I think you'd better look at this," Susie said, and took Sarah to the window. The view was down into some sort of merchant's yard, and it was full of row upon row of terracotta pots all stacked up on top of each other. They started to clean the flat, and when they got to the kitchen, they both felt a feeling of nausea and dread. "Come on, let's hurry up and clear out of here," said Susie, and they completed the work as soon as they could. The dream continued every few months as before. "Help me, help me," the woman always repeated. 2 or 3 years later, Sarah had moved to London, but was visiting an old friend in Brighton. One night they were both invited to a house party. When they got there, Sarah was horrified to find it was the same flat from the dream. After a few drinks, she got chatting with the new owner of the flat, and she told him the whole story. All about the figure in the bedroom asking for help. He suddenly looked serious. He explained that he'd recently found out that a woman had killed herself in the bedroom. But the strange thing was, The flat had been redesigned so that the kitchen now stood where the bedroom had been. So that explained the nausea both she and Susie had felt in the kitchen. It all made sense. But why the recurring dream? A medium friend of Sarah's explained that the spirit of the dead woman had probably been reaching out to Sarah, aware of her latent psychic abilities. She was literally only a few doors away. She had been guiding her to the flat in any way she could. The medium agreed to visit the flat and perform a ceremony to help the spirit move on. After that, the dream never returned. The spirit had been calling out to Sarah over all those years through the dreams, just desperate for help to move on. We have to hope she is now at peace. I was teaching at a university in Lefka, a small town that had suffered greatly during the 1974 war between the Greeks and the Turks. The new university had brought new life to the area. The locals cashed in on the influx of students by renting out their old dilapidated family homes, whilst withdrawing to more modern apartments. One of my students, Kamal, and his sister Melda, had decided to rent one of these houses. It was a beautiful old Ottoman townhouse, dating back at least a century. Although verging on dereliction, it had an old-world charm, with large, drafty rooms, creaking floorboards, and crumbling plaster walls. The elderly landlady showed them around the house, reciting a list of house rules as she went. On the ground floor, she gestured towards one of the doors and explained that the room was to always remain locked and off-limits. She did not elaborate further and moved on with the tour. Over the coming weeks, the students became aware that the locals were giving them strange looks as they entered the house. On one occasion when Kamal was in the local shop, he mentioned where he was living. The shopkeeper asked him to wait while he finished serving a couple of customers and gestured for him to pull up a chair. Over a couple of glasses of hot, sweet Turkish tea, he told Kamal the whole story. The story started in 1974 during the war. There had been fighting between the Greeks and Turks in the town, and a Greek soldier had taken refuge in the house. A group of Turkish soldiers had followed him there, and after a shootout he was killed inside the house. Over the following 20 years, rumors had abounded that strange things were happening in the house, especially in the room where the soldier had been killed. Eventually, the landlady and her son had moved out of the house and into their new apartment, leaving the house to fall into ruin. Later that evening, Melda was cleaning the house. Inside one of the storerooms, she noticed a small key hanging on a nail just inside the door. She knew at once which door it would open. She fleetingly considered having a look inside the locked room, but was distracted by the arrival of 3 friends. When Kamal returned, he excitedly shared with the group what the shopkeeper had told him. A debate started about whether or not to have a peek inside the room now that they had the key. Eagerly, the boys agreed, if only to have the opportunity to frighten the girls. Melda turned the key in the lock with a nervous hand. It opened smoothly, and she reached inside to find the light switch. The light didn't work. The group all peered inside from the threshold, not daring to enter. The room was nearly pitch black, with only a trickle of light from around the edges of the wooden shutters. No furniture, just bare boards and cobwebs. Silence. Minutes passed, and then suddenly, just the faintest noise like a floorboard being walked upon. The girls screamed, and the door was slammed shut and hurriedly locked again. That night, Melda awoke at 3 a.m. Someone was speaking in a low, deep voice, almost a whisper. It was like hearing one side of a conversation on a phone. She thought perhaps Kamal was talking to their parents back in Istanbul. She strained to hear, and slowly realized that she didn't understand the words. It was Greek. She sat up in bed. The room was almost pitch black. Then she noticed, in the corner of the room, a pinprick of light like a firefly. It moved slowly across the room towards her, and its outline shimmered as its size fluctuated. There was no bedside lamp, and to reach the light switch meant crossing the room. So she pulled the bedsheets up around her neck and closed her eyes tightly. Then she had the strangest feeling someone was looking at her. A presence in the room. The more scared she became, the less she dared to open her eyes. She opened them the merest crack. There was a shadow falling across her face. She opened her eyes. A face with sad, desperate eyes was there for a split second, and then it was gone. Kamal and Melda left the house the next day and never returned. 10 years later, I returned to Lefka and drove past the house. It was more or less completely derelict. The roof had collapsed and the lower floor windows were all boarded up. I couldn't help thinking that perhaps the Greek soldier still resided there, alone and finally undisturbed. The story begins in the early 2000s when Stephen, a friend of mine, had just started a new job as the manager of a pub in Brighton. It was a very old building and had been a public house since Victorian times. Most of the customers were gay women, and Stephen and I were often the only two men in the bar. On one such night, just after closing time, we were sitting chatting and laughing on one of the sofas. I suddenly caught something out of the corner of my eye. A wine glass had moved just slightly on the shelf behind the bar. Stephen laughed and told me that it was Lizzie. She was the resident ghost and particularly disliked men. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me, and we carried on our previous conversation. 10 minutes later, the glass smashed onto the floor. A stunned silence. No one was behind the bar, and there was no apparent reason as to why that should happen. Stephen seemed unrattled. "Oh, it happens all the time," he said, "especially when there are men around." He went on to describe something that had happened to him just after he started the job. He was locking up late one night, alone, and putting some things away down in the cellar. The cellar was dark and cold, with a musty smell. A single bulb hung in the center of the room, casting long, dark shadows. He finished his work and started back up the stairs. The door had swung closed behind him, and he was surprised to find that it wouldn't open. There was no key or latch, and it felt as if someone was on the opposite side of the door holding it closed. He rattled the door and shouted out, thinking that one of the staff was having a joke with him. 5 minutes passed and he grew increasingly angry. The joke had gone on far too long. Then suddenly, the door released. He rushed out into the bar expecting to catch the culprit and have a laugh about it, but the bar was empty. He ran through to the secondary bar. Again empty. He felt a tingle down the back of his neck. Whoever it was must have run into the toilets to hide, he thought, and there was no other way out from there. He crossed the room past the pool table towards the toilet door. Then, just as he passed the pool table, he felt a sudden shove in his back, and he was propelled forwards against the wall, no one to be seen, and no one in the toilets. After that, he took the stories about Lizzie much more seriously. Every few weeks he would be in the cellar and the door would again close and stick. "Come on, Lizzie," Stephen would cry out, and usually the door released soon after. He avoided the pool table area as much as he could. Lizzie didn't feel like a malevolent presence, more like a prankster who really didn't like him. It was only after Stephen had left the job that we found out Lizzie's true story. It was a previous manager who told us. Lizzie and her husband had owned the pub back in the late 1800s. They had a tempestuous relationship, and the husband often beat her. One night they had a huge argument, and he beat her to death in the room where the pool table now was. So it seems her spirit was never at peace, and still resided in the pub. The strange thing was, women were never the victims of her pranks, only men. Having died from an abusive relationship, Lizzie just didn't like men. So if a group of men came to the bar, things were likely to happen, and having a resident male landlord was a really bad idea. Today, the bar has an all-female staff and a female landlady, so Lizzie remains inactive, if not completely at peace. The story begins in the late 1990s. I was renting a room in Brighton, in a place called Regency Square. It was a basement flat, and my room was at the end of a long dark corridor with only my bedroom door at the end of it. There was always a creepy atmosphere in that corridor, and it always seemed to be colder than the rest of the house. One night I returned home late. As I entered the main door, before I could reach for the light switch, I saw it. A dark shadow passed through the wall on one side of the corridor and then through the wall on the other side. It was all over in a second, but definitely not a trick of the light. My landlord returned 20 minutes later and found my terror very amusing. "Oh, it's just Betsy," he said. "She's in all the history books. Betsy Bedlam." He went on to tell me the whole story. Regency Square had been a military camp in the early 1800s. At that time, the apparition of Betsy was first seen by the soldiers encamped there. She was often seen on a pathway that ran alongside the military camp towards the sea, and was said to have staring eyes and a twisted face. This made her look like one of the inmates of the famous Bedlam lunatic asylum in London, and hence she received her nickname Betsy Bedlam. After terrifying her victims, she would continue on her way and fade into the darkness. When Regency Square was built, one side of the square was constructed over Betsy's path. Yet she still followed the same route like a recording on a perpetual loop. She had been seen by many of my neighbors, crossing the hallways and rooms that lay on her path, and the path passed through our flat just outside my bedroom door. Betsy is a perfect example of the stone tape theory. This theory is a paranormal hypothesis that suggests that some hauntings are not the spirits of the dead, but are caused by the imprinting of emotional or traumatic events onto the physical environment. The theory proposes that certain materials can act like a recording device, storing the energy or vibrations of past experiences and replaying them under certain conditions. They can only be perceived by people who are sensitive to them and at the right time. Betsy's backstory is not known, but she is not a malicious entity. She is a recording, repeating her route up and down the square, unaware of the terror she has been causing for the last 200 years. This theory of place memory would also explain why hauntings often follow from traumatic or emotional events. In Hampton Court in 1541, Catherine Howard, one of Henry VIII's wives, was arrested accused of adultery and treason. She managed to escape her guards and ran through one of the halls, bleeding and screaming. She was apprehended and ultimately executed, but this event is imprinted on the building and replayed under the right conditions. She has been seen reenacting the scene for hundreds of years. Then there is the case of the Treasurer's House in York. Here, Roman soldiers have allegedly been seen in the cellars many times, marching through from wall to wall. But they can only be seen from the knee up, since the original Roman road was a meter below the basement level. They are a perfect example of the stone tape theory. People cannot interact with the apparitions, they are just seeing a historical event being replayed. Paranormal experts are divided on this theory. If it is true, then there should be a scientific method for recreating the conditions to replay such events. But to date, no such experiment has been successful. The reason for Betsy Bedlam's perpetual journey up and down the terrace of Regency Square is lost to history, although her image is not. She will continue to terrify those on her path when the conditions are right. For myself, knowing that Betsy meant no harm didn't stop the shiver down my spine whenever I crossed her pathway outside my bedroom door, just in case she happened to be passing. Devon in England is particularly rich in supernatural legends. The bleakness of Dartmoor has given rise to numerous tales of spirits and entities, but this is the tale of a particularly hostile manifestation. It is the legend of the hairy hands. The entity is confined to a particular narrow stretch of moorland road between the villages of Postbridge and Princetown. It's now known as the B3212. There are many accounts of encounters with this malevolent spirit. A typical story usually starts when driving along this road on a cold, dark night. Suddenly, a gruesome pair of hairy, calloused hands appears from nowhere and grabs the wheel, trying to steer you off the road with inhuman strength. The first incident was in June 1921, when E.H. Helby, a medical officer at Dartmoor Prison, was killed as his motorcycle became uncontrollable and crashed. His children were in the sidecar, and they told the story of their father wrestling with the controls, shouting at them to jump out. They jumped clear, but the father crashed and didn't survive. Several weeks later, a coach driver lost control of his vehicle, and several people were thrown out of their seats. The driver claimed invisible hands wrenched control of the steering wheel. On the 26th of August, 1921, an army captain on a motorcycle with a pillion passenger was driven off the road at the same spot. The passenger insisted he saw large hairy hands grab the handlebars and steer them off the road. The London papers picked up on the story, and it became nationwide news. The captain described the experience.
"It was not my fault. Believe it or not, something drove me off the road. A pair of hairy hands closed over mine. I felt them as plainly as ever I felt anything in my life. Large, muscular, hairy hands. I fought them for all I was worth, but they were too strong for me. They forced the machine into the turf at the edge of the road, and I knew no more till I came to myself, lying a few feet away on my face on the turf."
In 1924, a young couple were camping in a caravan near this road, and the woman was woken in the middle of the night by a sudden terror.
I knew there was some power very seriously menacing us near, and I must act very swiftly. As I looked up to the little window at the end of the caravan, I saw something moving, and as I stared, I saw it was the fingers and palm of a very large hand, with many hairs on the joints and back of it, clawing up and up to the top of the window, which was a little open. I knew it wished to do harm to my husband sleeping below. I knew that the owner of the hand hated us and wished harm, and I knew it was no ordinary hand, and that no blow or shot would have any power over it. Almost unconsciously, I made the sign of the cross, and I prayed very much that we might be kept safe. At once the hand slowly sank down out of sight, and I knew the danger was gone. I did say a thankful prayer and fell at once into a peaceful sleep. We stayed in that spot for several weeks, but I never felt the evil influence again near the caravan. But I did not feel happy in some places not far off, and would not for anything have walked alone on the moor at night or on the tor above our caravan.
In the following years, the stretch of road became notorious for accidents. Survivors, if there were any, told of the large, rough hands covered in hair trying to force them off the road. In some cases, the hands were invisible. This could happen to cars, motor coaches, cyclists, and even pony and traps. Journalist and author Rufus Endell claimed he experienced the hands while driving near Postbridge.
"A pair of hands gripped the driving wheel, and I had to fight for control. I managed to avoid a crash, and the hands disappeared as inexplicably as they had come."
The account was published in a book on supernatural Dartmoor, but he requested that the story wouldn't be published until after his death. Another anonymous account was posted online.
"I live on the road that goes toward Princetown, but I've heard it happen to people elsewhere in Devon. My uncle was working late for a builder when he got held up and came home a different way and had to go down that road. He was driving a small van and said it was very dark, and at first he felt like the van was being followed or someone was watching him and just felt spooked anyway. Then he thinks he saw someone on the side of the road, but he knew no one was there. When he went further down the road, he felt his van grabbed like by a force, and he could not keep the steering wheel straight, so he was going to go into the side of the road. He is a builder and a big, strong man, not a weakling, and was trying to turn the wheel as hard as he could, but no way. Then he felt something on the wheel and looked down, as his eyes were just on the road till then, and saw a pair of large hands covered in hair on the wheel grabbing it and pushing the other way. His van went up on the verge and banged hard onto the grass moor and almost wound up hitting a tree, but stopped. Just then, the hands disappeared, but he was really scared. Luckily, someone came up the road a few minutes later behind him in another car and stopped to see he was all right, as he was up on the bank, so had clearly come off the road. And he was all right, but was in shock. My uncle still swears blind that this happened to him, and he is not someone who admits to things like this. That was 20 years ago, but he did not know about the story of hairy hands till he was told about it.
The origins of the hands are not known, and the only motive seems to be to drive motorists off the road. As with any legend, they can become embellished over time on retelling. With no clear backstory, storytellers add their own details. Some local stories attribute them to an unnamed man who died in an accident on the road, or to an escaped convict from Dartmoor prison. It's also been suggested that the strange Dartmoor beast is the original owner. One American website alleges that sightings of Bigfoot-type humanoids have been reported in the area. Another tale is that a Bronze Age village stood on the road, so the hands are angry at their resting place being disturbed. Or my personal favorite,
A chap worked at the gunpowder factory at Powder Mills. He went to work in hobnailed boots that sparked on the stone floor, igniting the gunpowder which killed him, leaving nothing but his hands, which now terrorized the road.
Legends of disembodied hands are not confined to the UK. An American man called John Berry, reading the tale online in 2020, was shocked to see the similarity with his own experience driving in New York State.
When it happened to me, I was driving north, all alone at night on Route 390 in New York State. It was a particularly hot evening, and so I had my driver's side window rolled down. It was early summer, and the year was 1987. For miles, both in front and behind me, it seemed like I was the only vehicle on the entire highway. I remember feeling very calm, and if anything, a bit bored. Suddenly things got very interesting. From literally out of nowhere, two disembodied, large, white-skinned hands reached in through my open driver's side window. The knuckles and fingers of the hands were large, and the backs of both hands had a growth of long white hairs. These hands were physically powerful. Their grip was like that of a mechanical vice. The hairy hands grabbed the top right portion of the steering wheel and immediately proceeded to push down, hard, and to the right. The center of the steering wheel, for that model and year of car, had the usual horizontal V partition, extending both left and right, that connected with the outer circle portion of the steering wheel. Somehow, my reflexes responded instantly. Somehow, I got the open palm of my right hand positioned directly underneath the steering wheel that extended to the right, and I got my right elbow propped directly on top of my right knee. With the additional assistance of my left hand, I started cranking counterclockwise on the right V of the steering wheel, just as if it were a breaker bar socket wrench. For several seconds, I, using both hands and my right knee, arm wrestled against the vice-like strength of the hairy hands. Somehow I managed to keep the car going straight, although I was now traveling down the right shoulder of the highway, as if it were a lane. Just the same, the hairy hands were slowly succeeding to steer me into the ditch, when, very suddenly, the hairy hands retracted back out through the open driver's side window. My car then lurched, hard to the left, as a result of my oversteering counterclockwise. Somehow I got it together, avoided crashing, and resumed traveling straight down the appropriate highway lane. Until today, I never told anyone about what had happened.
In Welsh folklore, there is a story about a man called Roberts. Instead of attending church on Sunday, Roberts went gathering nuts in the nearby fields. When he saw a plentiful supply on a bush, he was just about to reach out when a disembodied hand appeared. Roberts assumed that the hand was the devil's own and mended his ways. In Mexico, there is the legend of La Mano Peluda, hairy hand, or Mano Pachona, furry hand. A Mayan shaman was killed during the Inquisition in Mexico. He was chopped up and buried in an old Native American cemetery. But before his death, he had cast a spell on his hand so that it would come to life to hunt his inquisitors. The legend is used to scare children, and the hands are said to lurk under the beds of naughty children, hoping to grab their ankle and drag them away if they refuse to sleep. Skeptics insist that most of the accidents on the road have been caused by grockles or tourists unfamiliar with the area, driving too fast down narrow country roads with high-walled sides, resulting in them losing control. It was eventually determined that the accidents were most likely due to the camber of the road's surface, and this was duly altered by the local council. There is also another possible influence on the legend. The French fantasy novel The Hands of Orlac by Maurice Renard was first published in 1920, the year before the first incident. In the novel, a pianist loses his hands in an accident. A talented surgeon gives him new hands, transplanted from a freshly guillotined killer, but they take on a malevolent life of their own. Perhaps this book, which was later a silent film, had captured the imagination of the population. Whatever the origins, the sheer number of reports and their striking similarity can't be disputed. So if you find yourself on the moors on a cold, dark night, perhaps set a route that avoids that particular stretch of road. I first heard stories of the Karabasan when I was living in Turkey. One of my students claimed to have woken in the night to find herself facing upwards and unable to move. Feeling afraid, she gradually became aware of a presence in the room, watching her. With her terror increasing, from the corner of her eye she could see the shadows coalescing. They began to form a humanoid shape, which then slowly moved across the ceiling above her. She could make out the outline of a head and a large hat. Unable to scream or move, she knew that this was the Karabasan, a malevolent entity from Turkish folklore that preyed on young women. Turkish legend tells that if you are able to knock off the hat from the creature, you will receive all the treasures of the world. But of course you are paralyzed and unable to do so. She closed her eyes tight, praying the creature would leave her in peace. And the next thing she knew, it was morning. Had she imagined it? Turkish people are taught that the only way to ward off the creature is by reciting verses from the Quran or by wearing talismans inscribed with Islamic verses. A couple of years later, I experienced the Karabasan myself. After a night out on the town, I awoke in the early hours on my back and unable to move. I experienced a feeling of absolute panic and terror. I felt utterly defenseless and vulnerable. I also felt a presence in the room, a presence that was watching me. I tried to call out to my housemate, but it was impossible to form any words or sounds. I closed my eyes tight, praying that I wouldn't see the creature, and the next thing I knew, it was morning. Over the years, I've often mentioned this experience to friends, and have been surprised to find that the legend seems to exist in most cultures of the world, with slight variations. In Italy, there is the legend of the Panda Fece. This is described as an evil witch, a malevolent spirit, or even a humanoid cat. She can be warded off by sleeping on your back, keeping a broom by the bedroom door, or by putting a pile of sand by the bed. In Egypt and the wider Islamic world, the entity is often described as a jinn, a spirit-like creature from Islamic legend. Canadian Eskimos attribute the experience to the spells of shamans, who hinder your ability to move and provoke hallucinations of a shapeless presence. In the Japanese tradition, the creature is a vengeful spirit who suffocates his enemies while they sleep. In Nigerian culture, a female demon attacks during dreaming and provokes paralysis. In Brazilian folklore, we find the pisadeira, a character described as a crone with long fingernails who lurks on roofs at night and tramples on the chest of those who sleep on a full stomach with their belly up. In Dutch folklore, there is a creature called the dabsog, or nightmare spirit. The legends may also be derived from the Sumerian stories of the succubus, which date back to 2400 BC. These are demonic beings that look like women and lure men in their dreams, usually for sex. The name succubus comes from Latin and means to lie under. They are often attractive and charming, but they may also show some signs of being demons, such as having wings, horns, tails, or glowing eyes. They are thought to drain the life force of men, and they may also attempt to have children with them. The opposite of a succubus is an incubus, which is a male demon that seduces women. Some stories say that the first succubus was Lilith, who was the first wife of Adam in some Jewish traditions. She left Adam, and rather than obey God, became a demon that preyed on women during childbirth. To this day, in many Middle Eastern maternity wards, some women still wear talismans for protection. Succubi are found in many cultures and religions, and they have different names and features depending on the source. For example, in Arabic folklore, they are known as Karina or Silat. In Hindu mythology, they are known as Yakshini or Mohin. In Japanese folklore, they are known as Yuki-onna or Kijo, and in African folklore, they are known as Popobawa or Tikoloshe. Science explains the experience as being a medical condition called parasomnia, or sleep paralysis. It occurs mainly during awakening and may be related to emotional stress. People who experience this wake to find themselves unable to move. This may be accompanied by a pressure in the chest, hallucinations, or a feeling that there is a malevolent presence in the room. Some people fear that death is imminent. Most people experience sleep paralysis when sleeping on their backs. The lack of ability to move can be explained by the persistence of a chemical, normally only present during sleep, which prevents us from acting out our dreams in the real world. Under certain conditions, this chemical can linger for a few seconds after awakening and cause a sense of panic. Interestingly, a modern manifestation of sleep paralysis are the reports of alien abductions. Abductees often claim to have been taken from their beds and have experienced an inability to move prior to their abduction. This is then accompanied by a feeling of a presence in the room, and then the appearance of creatures from the shadows. So does sleep paralysis explain all the appearances of the Carabasson? Do we all just interpret our sleep analysis experiences according to our own traditions and folklore? And are all the sightings of this entity merely hallucinations? I, for one, do not wish to repeat my own experience. Until next time, sleep well.